Murdock's Music Minute, the unpredictable, the ramshackle channel that gives some love to guitar-based music with album reviews, discography rankings, and all that jazz with a thick accent. For those who've maybe seen my last video on Nick Drake's Brighter Later and who got the feeling, this is all getting a bit too miserable and depressing now, maybe today's video will turn things around as we dive into the strange and wonderful land of psychedelia. For this, I've tried to come up with some psychedelic background, and no, this is not by me. I couldn't paint a picture to save my life. Before we head into the album in question, 3 disclaimers though. Number 1, today's review includes substance abuse and mind-altering experiences. Secondly, I'm not the biggest fan of the band in question, which means you won't get a well-researched, super informed fanboy review here. And thirdly, for those who believe that a source of information is only trustworthy if it shakes around a CD or vinyl copy of the album that is reviewed in front of the camera, let it be known that I don't own the album I'm going to talk about today in physical format. Still, I've got my 2 ears attached, and if you can look past all this, come and join me and most of all the Rolling Stones in the acid test of 1967 on their album, their Satanic, Majesties Request.
The Rolling Stones, bad boys of the 1960s, rock and roll band par excellence, and key figures in re-importing the blues to the United States. The band was formed in London in 1962, and the original classic lineup consisted of Mick Jagger, the flamboyant frontman, the multi-instrumentalist and eccentric Brian Jones, Keith Richards, bass player Bill Wyman, and the drummer Charlie Watts, who actually came from a jazz background. The Stones early on were very much focused on rhythm and blues, and the press stylized them as a sort of grittier, less well-behaved version of the Beatles. This rivalry probably can only be compared to the one cooked up by the press in the 1990s, namely that of Blur versus Oasis. Just like the Beatles, the Stones started very much as a covers band. They concentrated on blues covers, but with the success of the Beatles and the idea of bands who wrote their own material, also the Stones were urged to produce their own songs and feed the singles market. Their more unwashed look and rowdy live performances not only led to riots inside and outside of concert halls, but of course helped shaping their notorious image. Musically, the Rolling Stones are of course icons of rock and roll and of the development of rock music in the 1960s. They recorded such timeless singles like I Can Get No Satisfaction, The Last Time, Sympathy for the Devil, Jumping Jack Flash, or Painted Black. While their albums, compared to the Beatles but also other 1960s peers, for a longer time still remained a little bit uneven and very much a mix between bluesy cover versions and a few self-penned titles. With the increasing success of their own singles, the Rolling Stones also put more effort into their albums. Most importantly, 1966 Aftermath and Between the Buttons from early 1967. Both these albums are usually referred to as classics of the British invasion period and are two of the most cohesive albums from the Rolling Stones' classic period in the mid and late 1960s. At what was to be seen as the height of their popularity in 1967, however, the band had to face a rather hard time. Their notoriety fired back on them, and the Stones famously became the focus of a VIP drug bust in the UK. And for a while, the Stones made more headlines with their scandals than with their music. In fact, most of the year 1967 was spent by the individual band members in court or in conflict with the authorities. Brian Jones even was pretty close to a prison sentence, and when the charges finally were mostly dismissed, or sentences at least turned out milder than feared before, the musical world had turned and left the Stones behind. And then came, in late 1967, their Satanic Majesties request. The Beatles had released their Sgt. Pepper's, and the Stones felt they had to react to the new musical trends and the overall spirit of the times. After some potentially blasphemous ideas for the cover image of their new album, the band settled on this very zeitgeisty LSD Fairyland cover design. Opinions on this album to this day are pretty divided, so let's see what's behind all this, shall we?
By 1967, even the rascals in the Rolling Stones felt it was time for a change and maybe a dose of flower power culture. This was to be achieved in a general change in songwriting, the use of exotic instruments, studio trickery, and an overall swing of the magic wand. But most of all, probably the intake of psychotropic substances. Chaos reigned during the sessions, and at one point, the old manager and producer Andrew Luke Oldham threw in the towel, leaving the band to themselves. The result was an album that sounds like a trippy Boy Scout excursion gone out of control. The first track on the album, Sing This All Together, makes it clear from the very start, this is hippie vibe and we want you all to join in. Sit around the bonfire, probably take some LSD and start singing. The song features rather sloppy guitar strumming, random percussion, and it really has got that impromptu singing during a party in the kitchen vibe if it wasn't for a brass section in the background. This was very clearly a different kind of Rolling Stones from the previous albums. The second track, Citadel, then takes us into the slightly spooky, hazy, psychedelic wonderland that the Rolling Stones, or most of the band members, not everyone was up for it, had in mind for this project. There's reverb guitar, some strange instrumentation make the song not unlike what the Pretty Things, for instance, were releasing during that time. The song seems to be a social comment, but its lyrics remain a little bit vague. The third track, In Another Land, was written and sung by bass player Bill Wyman, of all people. This one clearly pokes fun at the entire psychedelic trend of the times and of the project, their Satanic Majesties request in general. It is a clearly psychedelic song. It has a meandering structure, harpsichord treble effects on the vocals and all that. Yes, it's clearly parodies the entire idea of psychedelia. Funnily enough, the song also features more members of the Small Faces than of the actual Rolling Stones. Bill Wyman more or less recorded the song without the Stones, as he one evening came into the studio because he had forgotten or hadn't been informed that the session for that evening actually had been cancelled. So he took the opportunity to record this ditty that he had in mind, or maybe also to express that he was a little bit pissed off with the whole charade of the Rolling Stones doing a psychedelic album. Curiously, the song was released as a single, and it is probably one of the strangest singles the Rolling Stones have ever put out. Next up, 2000 Man. For me, this is the first really memorable track on the album. It's got a little bit of a country rock backbone to it, but then gets drenched in Hammond organ. Again, sound-wise, I was a little bit reminded of the Pretty Things or even the Kinks on this number. The song picks up a popular topic in late 1960s psychedelia, a look at the future, and it is a slightly disturbing look. The A-side ends with "Sing This All Together, See What Happens," a sort of reprise of the opening track. It's that typical loose, completely unstructured jam track that one would find on psychedelic albums of that era. It certainly promotes those who say that psychedelia was simply about playing chaotic, funny noises and calling it experimental and far out. Yes, probably a little bit a waste of vinyl, this one. Still, it captures the spirits of the times quite accurately. If your expectations after this pointless noodling are rather low for side 2, then She Comes in Colors will pull up the listener immediately. This is hands down an absolutely fantastic track. It is the most outright pop tune the Stones ever did, and with this one they almost outdo the Beatles. From the catchy chorus to the string arrangement to the very memorable but sophisticated piano work by session crack Nicky Hopkins, who seemed to be on every second album in the late 1960s. This is just a phenomenal pop song. It's an undisputable classic single of the late 1960s and easily the strongest track of the whole album. The next song, The Lantern, is at its core a rather bluesy track. It's a metaphysical or esoteric love story with one of the lovers having passed away. The song meanders a little bit, but probably comes closest to what fans would have expected a Stones album to sound like. Gomper, the song that follows, is that token of a laid-back, fake Indian psychedelic song, and thus again sounds very much of its time. It has got a nice melody, bongo accompaniment, and overall is very trippy and gentle until it then fades out with a long-drawn, droning and rather nonsensical jam. Again, the listener probably will start to wonder whether this isn't simply meant as a parody of the psychedelic music that was around and very popular at that time. Gomper seeks directly into 2000 light years from home, an outstanding track. It's literally the spaciest song on the album and almost resembles early Pink Floyd. This one's where the drugs worked, to some extent. It's got an eerie, memorable bass line and even spookier mellotron in the background. Certainly the band members felt light years removed from what was happening around them. This is a bona fide psychedelic rock track and truly a highlight for me on this album. That leaves us with On With The Show as the closing track. That's a nice little psych pop ditty with a vaudeville, dance hall, old-fashioned show type flavor. And it's a song that also wouldn't be misplaced on a Kings album of the same era. Another band that never really fully dabbled in psychedelia, but certainly tipped an ironic toe into the multicolored stream of the psychedelic movement. Their Satanic Majesties request ever since has split Rolling Stones fans into one group that says that it is an overlooked or misunderstood psychedelic classic, and a second rather large group that would claim that this album is the first real misstep in the Rolling Stones' career. It also leaves me a little bit undecided myself. I like it as a Rolling Stones record for being so very different and adventurous and sometimes tongue-in-cheek. As a psychedelic rock album, it's pretty much hit and miss. It actually emphasizes some of the follies of bad or cheap psychedelia in those days, and there are certainly tons of better psychedelic albums from the late 1960s. Nonetheless, if you haven't heard this album, give it a try simply to hear it once. There are some real nuggets here and there on this album, and especially if you are a fan of psychedelic music. Overall, I can definitely give the attribute psychedelic. The divisive nature of their Satanic Majesties requests also becomes clear from its performance and reception. The album was pretty successful both in the UK and the USA, where it cracked the top 5, but very quickly slipped off the charts again. And as I mentioned before, rather quickly was then seen or judged as a bit of a failed or flawed experiment. The band themselves have distanced themselves as well from this album. Still, it's not a complete dud, not at all actually. So maybe find out for yourself and experiment a little bit with this colorful, strange and bizarre album. Until then, I hope you'll come back from that trip and see you again, maybe in another video. Bye.